Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Office Hours Google Associate Cloud Engineer Certification Exam. We are so excited to have you with us today and are honored to be part of your cloud engineer journey. So without further ado, I'll let Daniel take the lead.
Hello everyone. My name is Daniel Mease, and I'm a GCP instructor / content creator here at Cloud Academy. Welcome to our webinar about the Google Associate Cloud Engineer Certification Exam. So, what should you expect? Well, I'm going to start out by covering the exam details. This will include the cost, format, and grading. Then, I'll take you through the official exam guide, and I'll describe any topics that you need to study. After that, I'll share some general test strategies and then run you through a few sample questions. And finally, the last 10 to 15 minutes will be reserved for an interactive Q&A session. Now, we have a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it all. So, to make sure that we finish on time, I'm going to ask everyone to please hold your questions until the end. If you think of a question as we're going along, just go ahead and write it down. A lot of times that question will be answered in a later section, but if not, then you can still ask them during the Q&A. Now, in case you were wondering, there are no prerequisites for this webinar. It's not going to be super technical. Basically, if you can use a computer, then you should be able to follow along. I do suggest being prepared to take some notes. Now, while you rummage around for a pen and paper, I can go ahead and share a little bit about myself. So I've been teaching cloud technologies for about 6 years now. Currently, I'm focused on Google Cloud Platform. But in the past, I've also taught AWS and Azure classes as well. So I used to work for Amazon, and I created a lot of their official in-person AWS classes. And I also used to teach the engineers at LinkedIn. So I've had experience using all three of the main cloud providers. Now, before I was a technical instructor, I was a software developer for like 15 years. I've had a pretty extensive technical background. I'm not just reading about all this stuff, I've actually spent a lot of time using it as well. And as a developer, I was mostly focused on web, but I did do some mobile stuff as well, and I've worked for a pretty wide range of companies. All right, that's enough about me. Now, I assume this next part will be obvious, but I want to be explicit just in case. Simply attending this webinar will not be enough preparation to pass the exam. This webinar is going to tell you what to study. It is not a replacement for studying. Now, the exam assumes that you're going to have at least 6 or more months of hands-on experience using GCP. And obviously, there's no way I can condense 6 months into a 1-hour lecture. So, unless you've already been using GCP for a while, you should probably plan to spend a good amount of time studying. Now, you can do this several ways. If you want to do it for free, you can just read through all of Google's online documentation. There is some really good stuff out there. Aside from all the technical docs, they have frequently asked questions, quick starts, and even blog posts. And everything is available online for free. However, that does not mean that the information is well organized, nor is it always easy to find. It feels a lot like Wikipedia. All the information is there somewhere, but it's not really structured for easy reading, especially when you're talking about reading multiple articles. So, this is why we offer training courses at Cloud Academy. Now, we have a whole learning path that's dedicated to the ACE exam. It contains a good mix of lectures, labs, and quizzes. Everything is laid out in a logical progression, and each concept builds upon the previous one. So, if you go through the entire path, you can cover all the main concepts. In fact, this is exactly how I got my certification. I watched the same lectures, did the same labs, and I passed the exam on my very first try. Now, if you decide to try and study on your own, remember that the exam is going to assume that you have some practical experience. So it's not enough to just know the features of Compute Engine and Cloud SQL. You also need to understand how a virtual machine running in Compute Engine can access a database in Cloud SQL. Google Cloud is all about connecting multiple services together to build something bigger. So, it's critical that you don't just read or listen, you need to practice as well. And the labs in the Cloud Academy Learning Path will help a lot with that. I also want to make you aware that we have a number of playground environments as well. Now, these are special labs that don't expect you to follow a particular path, but instead they allow you to experiment on your own. So basically, it's a cheap and safe way to try some crazy things. Of course, you could always experiment with your own GCP account, but you need to be careful. You don't want to accidentally break something important. And you also don't want to end up spending a bunch of money. So, for example, if you provision a powerful Kubernetes cluster and then forget to delete it, you might end up with a pretty sizable bill. I've had some students tell me horror stories. Now, with Cloud Academy Labs, you don't have to worry about any of that. Our labs run in our environment, and once you end a lab, we clean everything up. We also foot the bill for any resources that were created. So, if you want, you definitely can study on your own, but Cloud Academy can make preparation a lot easier and a lot more fun. All right, let's talk about the exam. Now, first, know that there are only 2 prerequisites for taking the ACE exam. You need to be at least 18, and second, you need to have $125. Now, this is less than the professional exams. Those all cost $200. So, if you're planning to get multiple certs, keep in mind that the prices can be different. So, what happens if you manage to fail the exam? Well, first of all, you can retake it. However, you will have to pay the $125 fee again. Now, when you fail the first time, you'll have to wait 14 days before retaking the exam. If you fail a second time, then of course you're going to have to pay the fee again, but this time you have to wait 60 days. And if you fail a third time, you have to pay the fee, and then you have to wait 1 year. So, failing once isn't the end of the world, but you really do not want to fail the exam multiple times. Now, when you do pass, your certification will be good for 2 years. After the 2 years is up, you have to take the exam again and pay the fee. Now, currently there is no special renewal process. Getting your cert for the first time is the exact same as renewing your cert. Basically, it's because after 2 years, everything you learned is probably out of date. Google certifications are not something that you earn once and then keep for life. They do have limited lifespans. But this is true for all cloud providers. Now, currently, the ACE exam is composed of 50 questions, and all the questions are multiple choice. So don't worry, you're not going to be required to provision a database or debug any virtual machines. I think Microsoft Azure has some practical labs in some of their exams, or at least they used to. Not sure if they still do. But GCP exams just require filling in bubbles. And for some questions, you'll have to pick a single correct answer, but some other questions might require you to pick multiple. So you can get both types. Now, the questions are randomly chosen from a larger bank. So, even if 2 people take the same exam at the same time in the same location, their questions can be different. And I'm not just talking about order here. I mean, the questions themselves can be completely different. Now, Google does this to make cheating a lot more difficult. Even if you somehow got a legitimate copy of the exam, it probably wouldn't do you much good. Now, in order to pass, you do not need to score 100%. You can miss a few questions. However, we don't actually know what percentage constitutes a passing score. Google is pretty tight-lipped about the grading. Now, I assume this means they're doing something more sophisticated than just looking at the number of incorrect answers. It could be that certain questions are worth more than others, or maybe you're penalized for certain wrong answers more than others. Again, we don't actually know how Google grades the exams, so this is just me speculating. You should also be aware that when you finish the exam, you're not going to be provided any in-depth information at all. They just tell you whether you passed or not. That means you're not going to be told how many answers you got right or wrong. You're not going to be told which topics you did better on. You get nothing like that at all. You're simply provided either a pass or a fail with no explanations. And even if you do pass, they still will take a few days to confirm it. So it's possible to be told that you passed the exam, and then a week later you find out that you actually failed. Now, I assume they only do this in the cases where cheating is detected. They do record you while you take the exam, so I assume they use that time to review the video footage before giving you the actual certificate. Now, the exam lasts 2 hours, and time management is very important. 2 hours might seem like a lot of time, but it goes by pretty fast. And each question requires a bit of reading and some thought. There really aren't any simple questions like which database is best for scalability. Instead, most questions are usually mini scenarios that you have to read very carefully. You will be provided some constraints and some objectives, and then asked to pick the best solution. And there will be times where all the options will theoretically work, but only one answer is considered best practice. There are 2 delivery methods for taking the exam, on-site and online. Now, this is a significant decision. Some of you are probably thinking that the online option would be the easiest. That means you can take the test from the comfort of your own home, you can sit in your favorite chair, you don't even need to change out of your pajamas, right? There's no fighting traffic or looking for a parking space. It'll be super easy, right? Well, not necessarily. Taking the test remotely makes it significantly easier to cheat. So, if you choose to take the test online, you're going to be subjected to much higher scrutiny. They will have a proctor watching you via your webcam and listening via your microphone. So, if you leave the room or go off camera during the exam, that's going to be a huge problem. Even some things you never even considered could get you flagged. For example, if someone walks into the room while you're taking the test, or if they can hear someone outside the room talking. If your internet connection lags or your browser crashes, even something as innocuous as staring out a window. I mean, they don't know. Maybe you have a friend standing outside with the answers written on giant cue cards. Now, if instead you go to a testing center, you are going to be watched, but it's going to be way less invasive. Now, that's because they can control the room, and they can be fairly certain that you haven't taped the answers under your desk. So you'll be able to get away with a few more things. Like you could stare at the ceiling for a while as you work out a problem in your head. Now, you might laugh, but I did have a coworker that got into trouble for that. He was pondering a question and was staring straight up, and the proctor thought that he had the answers taped to the ceiling. So, if you go to a testing center, you're not going to have to worry about any distractions. There's not going to be any kids or pets to worry about. You won't have to worry about your phone ringing or your doorbell. And if there's some sort of technical issue, the people at the testing center will take care of it. So, I really encourage you to spend some time and think about which format would work best for you. Obviously, some people will prefer the online option, but I think most would have a less stressful time if they went to a testing center. There are just way less things that can go wrong, and less things you have to worry about. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about the actual content of the exam. Now, if you were not already aware, Google has provided an online exam guide. Here is the URL you can use to get to that. As you can see, it's broken down into 5 different sections. Google exam guides are critical. They help you zero in on exactly what you need to be familiar with. However, the problem is some of the entries can be kind of vague. They will often mention a topic or a product, but they don't always tell you exactly what you need to know. Also, there's going to be some implied topics that are not outright specified. So you need to learn to read between the lines a little bit in order to understand exactly what is going to be covered. So to help you out, I'll go through each section and I'll explain exactly what the item is asking for. Now, this is the part that you definitely want to take some notes. Okay, section 1 is setting up a cloud solution environment. Item 1.1 wants you to understand how to organize and prepare your GCP account for use. So, one of the main things you need to be familiar with is the resource hierarchy. Now that's where you have organizations on top, then folders, then projects, and then at the bottom you have your individual resources. You need to understand how Google expects you to structure things. And you also need to know how to make resources in Project A accessible to Project B. So that includes being familiar with setting up policies and identity access management. You should understand how to control access to different services by enabling or disabling the correct APIs. And they also expect you to know how to access logs and monitor your services using the operations suite. Now 1.2 is focused on billing. So you're going to need to know how to enable billing. You need to know how to manage multiple billing accounts, how to link certain projects to certain credit cards. You also need to understand what a budget is. And note, this is probably not what you think it is. In GCP, you can assign an amount as a budget to a particular project. However, this budget will not prevent you from exceeding that amount. It just sends out an alert. You're also going to need to understand how to access your billing details and how to export them. Now, 1.3 is all about using the command line tools. So, just a heads up, you're probably going to get a few questions about using the Cloud Software Development Kit. Now, when I took the exam, I was required to know the exact syntax for some of the more common commands. So, you need to be prepared. Remember, Google assumes that you've been using this stuff for 6 months. And so they don't think it's unreasonable to ask you to provide the exact command to upload a file or provision a VM. All right, and that's it for Section 1. Section 2 is about planning and configuring a cloud solution. Item 2.1 means that you should know what the pricing calculator is and be familiar with how to use it. 2.2 expects you to be able to choose the best compute resource for a given scenario. So that means you need to understand the trade-offs between compute engine, Kubernetes engine, Cloud Run, and Cloud Functions. That means you need to understand the details involved for each of those products, and you also need to be familiar with how to save money by using things like preemptible VMs. Now 2.3 is very similar to 2.2, except this is focused on data storage. So be familiar with cloud storage and all of the various databases. You need to know the trade-offs between all of them. And you need to be able to pick the right service based on business requirements. So, if a question asks about setting up a data warehouse, then you should immediately start thinking about BigQuery. You also need to understand the best practices and again how to save money by using cheaper storage options. Now 2.4 is the exact same thing, except this is about networking services. So you need to know which services are available, you need to understand when to choose one over the other, and you need to be familiar with common operations such as load balancing and managing DNS. All right, and that's it for Section 2. Section 3 is about deploying and implementing a cloud solution. Item 3.1 is a deep dive on Compute Engine. You're going to need to know all about provisioning and managing virtual machines, and this is not just the surface level stuff. You're going to need to know how to connect to and manage them. You're going to need to understand the differences between managing a Linux VM and a Windows VM. You also should be able to identify problems and debug any issues. Now, a lot of these questions are going to require some real-world experience. And that's why it's critical while you go through the labs or experiment with your own GCP account. Now, 3.2 is a deep dive on Kubernetes engine. So you need to know what kube control is and how to use it. You need to understand how to create and manage clusters. You should know what the various options are for clusters and when you should choose one over the other. They also assume you're going to be able to deploy and manage containers, and that you know how to set up logging and monitoring. Again, these questions are going to require some real-world experience. Now, 3.3 is all about Cloud Run and Cloud Functions. You'll have to be familiar with the trade-offs and when to use one or the other. You want to know how to scale your code and how to manage multiple versions. And then you also need to be familiar with what traffic splitting is, when it's needed, and how to do it. And finally, you also should understand how to trigger your code based off of certain events. Alright, 3.4 is all about storing and retrieving data. So, you need to know how to upload files. You need to know how to create tables and how to query them. You should be familiar with importing and exporting data. Pub/sub is pretty common, so you really need to understand how to use that. I also highly recommend understanding which of these services are typically used together. Now, 3.5 is all about networking. So you need to know how to set up networks, load balancers, firewalls, and VPNs. Your compute and storage services need to communicate. And so you need to understand how to connect them or isolate them as required. Security is also very important here, so make sure you understand best practices. Now, 3.6 covers the cloud marketplace. Compared to the others, this one's pretty simple. As long as you understand what the marketplace is and you know how to use it to deploy a solution, you should have this pretty well covered. Now, 3.7 is about managing your infrastructure via code and automation. Now, this is going to dip a little into the realm of DevOps, but anyone working with the cloud needs to understand the basic principles. So, play around with Cloud Foundation Toolkit and Config Connector to get a basic idea of how you can manage resources without having to do everything manually. And that's it for Section 3. Section 4 is ensuring successful operation of a cloud solution. So 4.1 wants you to be really familiar with maintaining compute engine VMs. You're going to need to know some more advanced stuff like attaching GPUs, working with snapshots and images, working with instance groups. Make sure you're comfortable doing all these things. 4.2 mentions GKE again. Basically, you need to be familiar with all the Kubernetes principles: pods, services, and node pools. You should understand what persistent volumes are and stateful sets. And you should also understand the difference between horizontal and vertical scaling as well. 4.3 covers more information about Cloud Run. Now, I don't think you need actual experience using Cloud Run for Anthos, but you should at least know what that is. 4.4 covers more data management tasks. You should know how to do all of these. 4.5 is more networking stuff. I don't think I have anything to add here. 4.6 is all about monitoring and logging. Now, for all of the products and services that were mentioned, you need to know how to find the logs. You also should understand how to set up monitoring and create alerts. That way, if something breaks, you can be notified right away. Now, you will get questions about what to do when there is a problem. So, you need to be familiar with common issues as well as how to fix them. Now, here's another area where real-world experience will pay off big time. So again, take advantage of our labs, or try to intentionally break things inside your own account and then figure out how to fix them. And that's it for Section 4. All right, last we have Section 5. This is about configuring access and security. So for Item 5.1, you need to know all about IAM. You need to know how to create accounts and assign permissions by using policies. You also need to understand the 3 types of roles and be familiar with all the best practices. For example, you should know that you generally want to avoid using primitive roles. All right, 5.2 is about service accounts. So, understand the difference between a user account and a service account. So, you should know how to assign permissions to a service and how to manage credentials. 5.3 is basically about monitoring for security issues. So, if something bad happens, know how to find out what happened in order to prevent it from happening again. And that's it for Section 5. So there you go. That's the list of everything you need to know before taking the exam. Next, let's talk about the best ways to prepare for this exam. So first of all, everyone always asks how much time should they spend studying. Now that's a really difficult question to answer, mostly because it's going to depend on how much you know starting out. Now, as I mentioned, Google recommends at least 6 months of hands-on experience. And some of you might already have a lot of cloud experience that can transfer over. So, depending upon your background, you might be ready to pass the exam after a week or two of study, but others could take several months. There are other factors like being well rested and not being constantly interrupted. These all affect how well you will retain any information. Also, you have to factor in how often you study. 80 hours spread over a week is very different than 80 hours spread over a month, or even 80 hours spread over a whole year. So, your ideal situation is to try and do something every day or maybe every other day. Maybe watch a video today and then tomorrow work on a lab. You want to give yourself enough time to digest any information, but not wait too long to actually put it into practice. You've probably all heard the expression, use it or lose it, and that's very much the case here. It's way too easy to hear about something new and then not use it and forget about it. So, don't try to learn everything at once. Pick one thing at a time and then practice it over and over again. It might also be a good idea to create a schedule. I think too many people plan to study whenever they have free time, and then of course they never have enough free time. So instead, consider blocking off spots on your calendar and then following through. You have to sort of approach it like exercising. You need to build up good habits. So at first it's going to be tough, but if you plan ahead and tough it out, eventually you'll find a rhythm that works best for you. Now, if you're lucky, you might be able to do some studying at work, and that's great, but make sure you talk to your manager first. Figure out how much time per week you can set aside. You might also need to adjust your weekly or monthly goals. And your team needs to be made aware that you might have a slight drop in productivity. Now, if you have to study at home, then you might want to consider talking to the people you live with. It's best to work out a plan so that they can help support you. You don't want to just randomly try to take over a room and expect everyone else to leave or be silent. Plan ahead and agree upon a schedule that works best for everyone. So, I can't give you a specific number of hours that you need to study, but I can recommend following 4 steps. And those are: 1. Learn the theory. 2. Get practical experience. 3. Complete several practice exams. And 4. Identify and close any knowledge gaps. Let's go into these steps in detail. So for number 1, learn the theory. The first thing you want to do is study all the different topics listed in the exam guide. Of course, the easiest way to do this is to complete the Cloud Academy learning path. My goal for every course is to give you just enough information that you can start playing around with it on your own. And we try to sprinkle in enough labs so you're not falling asleep listening to my voice for hours on end. Now, of course, depending upon your background and level of experience, you might need to supplement using other resources. For example, the Cloud Academy Learning Path assumes that you already understand how to use Docker. Now, if you didn't, then you might have to run through a few of our Docker courses and labs. If you don't have a Cloud Academy subscription, YouTube can be a decent source of information as well. All right, for item number 2, once you've mastered the theory, then you need to learn how to apply it. Now, this is going to help reinforce what you learned, and it will give you the practical experience required to answer certain questions. So, what does that mean? If you're learning about Cloud SQL, then you want to create some tables, maybe import some public records, and then try writing some queries. Now, to keep you motivated, try to use information that you're interested in. So, if you enjoy baseball, then use baseball stats. Keep in mind, if you're playing around with your own account, you want to be absolutely certain that you clean up after yourself. You don't want to create a bunch of resources and then forget to delete them. To help you out with this, I suggest that every morning you create a brand new project, and then all the resources that you provision, you assign to that project. Then, when you're ready to log out, you can delete that project and that'll clean everything up. You can also set up a budget alert so that the moment you start racking up charges, you're immediately notified. Of course, if you're using the Cloud Academy Labs, then this is not a concern. All right, for number 3, you want to try to complete several practice exams. Now, the Cloud Academy Learning Path does have a practice exam, and you should definitely take it and do it over and over again until you get 100%. But be aware, one practice exam is not a guarantee that you will pass the real one. Google can change their exams at any time. So your goal here is not so much to memorize answers, but instead it's to get comfortable with the exam format. I practice reading through and understanding what is being asked. I practice going through the options and eliminating the wrong answers. And I'm always working on my time management. You got to make sure that you don't take too long on any one question. You should know that on the exam, you can mark a question and come back to it later. So, I highly recommend taking advantage of the Cloud Academy practice exam, but you should also look online for others as well. Now, Google usually has some sample questions that you can run through, and these are probably the most accurate questions available online, but there are other practice exams out there as well. Now, I don't have any specific recommendations. You just have to go on Google and search for something like Google Associate Cloud Engineer Sample Questions, or maybe practice exam. The more questions you run through, the more comfortable you will get. Now, sometimes a question will be worded in a weird way, and it might take you a while to figure out what is being asked. And that's why it's a good idea to go through multiple exams from multiple sources. You'll get comfortable with being asked the same information in many different ways. And ultimately, this will help you alleviate your test anxiety. When you get enough practice reading questions, understanding what they're asking, and picking the right answer, it's going to become much less stressful. So, run through as many practice exams as it takes to get comfortable and confident. All right, for number 4, you want to identify any knowledge gaps that you have. So for this step, you're going to thoroughly review the exam guide. Now you're saying to yourself, wait, that was step 1. And yes, that's correct. In step 1, you were trying to focus on what you needed to study. So you're going to do that again in step 4 as a final verification. Make sure you didn't skip anything accidentally. Remember, the exam guide is your best source of information for the exam. If there's any conflict between the exam guide and some other resource, go by the exam guide. Now this means even when the exam guide is technically wrong. Now as an example, when I took my ACE exam, a few questions still referred to Operations Suite by its old name, which was Stackdriver. Now luckily I expected this going in because I read the guide. Luckily you don't have to worry about getting questions referring to Stackdriver anymore. They've updated the exam guide since. But just be aware, sometimes the exams lag behind. So, the rule is, when there's a conflict, you go by what the exam guide says, even if it's outdated or wrong. Reviewing the exam guide will also identify if Google made any last-minute changes. It's possible that when you first looked at the exam guide, it didn't mention a product, and then right before the exam you noticed a new product has been added. So, this 4th step is critical. It's going to allow you to identify any gaps in your knowledge and fill them before you actually take the exam. Alright, now it's time to run through some sample questions. Now please note that these are not real exam questions, but they're close enough that it should give you a good idea of what to expect. I'm going to focus on demonstrating a few techniques you can use to eliminate wrong answers and to zero in on the correct ones. Alright, so let's look at question number 1. You need to migrate a payroll application that runs on Windows 10 to Google Cloud Platform. Which compute service should you choose? And then you're provided 4 options: App Engine Standard, App Engine Flexible, Compute Engine, and Cloud Functions. Now this question is probably a little bit simpler than you'll see on the actual exam, but I think it's a good starter question. It follows the standard format where it's going to give you some background. In this case, you have an existing application that you use for payroll that's currently running on a Windows 10 system. And now you have to migrate that to Google Cloud. So the key to this question is really having a good understanding of the different compute services and knowing which is most appropriate for this situation. Now, if you read the 4 options and you're familiar with these products, hopefully immediately Cloud Functions jumps out as a wrong answer. Cloud Functions is not used for running arbitrary apps. It's used specifically for writing short little functions. It's pretty common that one of the answers you can immediately eliminate right away. So if we get rid of D, we know we're either dealing with App Engine or Compute Engine. Now, if you're familiar with the typical use cases for App Engine and Compute Engine, you'll know that typically Compute Engine is used for installing regular applications, whereas App Engine is typically used for installing containers. So right away, that gives you a pretty good idea that you should probably be leaning towards Compute Engine. App Engine can technically run Windows 10 containers. So it's theoretically possible you could take this payroll application, convert it to a Windows 10 container, and run it on App Engine. However, that's probably going a little bit deeper than what they were expecting. Also, if this is a payroll application that you just bought from some other company, it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to containerize this. So, while technically you might be able to pick a couple of these options, I think the clear answer here is Compute Engine. With Compute Engine, you can provision a Windows 10 server, and then you can install any Windows 10 applications that you desire. App Engine is much more typically used for containers written in things like Python, Java, Ruby, Go, that sort of thing. Okay, that one was pretty simple. Let's go on to something a little bit more complicated in question 2. This one says you need to select and configure compute resources for a set of batch processing jobs. Now, these jobs take about 2 hours to complete, and they need to run nightly. Now, if you want to minimize costs, what should you do? And then you're given 4 options. The first option says to select Google Kubernetes Engine and create a single node cluster using the cheapest instance type. The second option says to select Google Kubernetes Engine and create a cluster with autoscaling enabled. The third option is to select Compute Engine and use preemptible VM instances. And the fourth option is to select Compute Engine and use VM instances with attached GPUs. So this question is a little bit more complicated. It'll really help if you understand what batch processing jobs are and sort of how they work. Now in this case we usually run them at night. That's probably when everyone's logged off and gone home. And generally we need to make sure that they complete before everyone comes back into the office the next day. So you have some flexibility. Essentially, we're going to have a 12-hour window that we need to complete 2 hours worth of work. The other main factor here is that we want to focus on minimizing costs. So sometimes you'll be asked to optimize for different things. Sometimes it's scalability, sometimes it's reliability. Here it's about costs. The goal is to run the batch processing jobs in the constraints that are provided, but we also want to pick the option that's going to be the cheapest. Okay, so let's go through the 4 answers. Now, when I read through the answers, one of them jumped out immediately as clearly wrong. Having VM instances with attached GPUs is going to be more expensive, not less. Now, of course, they don't actually specify what these batch jobs are. I guess technically if you were working for Pixar and these batch jobs were rendering out frames in a movie, then maybe the attached GPUs would make sense. But for most companies, that's not going to be the case. So attaching GPUs to VM instances is going to cost more money, and most likely it's not going to help. So immediately we can eliminate D. So now we got 3 options left. A and B talk about using Google Kubernetes Engine and setting up a cluster. Now, if you understand Kubernetes, having a cluster sitting around all the time is going to cost money. And since these jobs are only running 2 hours every 24 hours, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. With Compute Engine, you don't have to have anything sitting around idle. You can fire up a virtual machine whenever you need it, let it run until it completes the job, and then shut it down. Also, preemptible VM instances are very, very cheap. So, if you're familiar with preemptible VM instances, you'll know this is a very good fit. So, it might be running for a while, and then in the middle of your job, it might need to shut down. Now, in this scenario, that's not really a problem. Because we're running a set of batch processing jobs, if it gets canceled halfway through, we just fire up another preemptible VM instance and continue processing. Even if we have to start over from the very beginning, 2 hours of processing will complete in the 10 or 12-hour window we have. C is definitely the best answer here. All right, let's move on to question number 3. This one asks, if you can't connect to a production VM via SSH, which 2 methods can you use to investigate without disrupting the existing traffic? So in this question, you're actually going to pick 2 answers. Okay, and the 4 options are: create a snapshot of the disk and use it to create a new disk, then attach the new disk to a new instance, generate a new SSH key pair and try to connect again, access the serial console output, or create a startup script to collect information. So if you haven't played around with virtual machines, if you haven't broken them and then tried to fix them, this might be a tough question. While you could create a startup script, you're never going to be actually to execute it without disrupting production. So D is not actually a valid option. The other option that's not really going to work is B. How are you going to upload that new SSH key pair to the VM? So in this case, A and C are the correct answers. Don't just pick something because it sort of sounds right. You really need to understand what's being described. All right, let's move on to question number 4. This one says that you want to see all the IAM policies that are defined for a project named Blue Widget Foo. What command would you use? And then you're provided 4 different versions of the gcloud command. In this case, hopefully you've used the gcloud command to list out IAM policies. This is going to be one of those things where you either know it or you don't. You can try to sort of logically guess what the correct answer would be. But in this case, the most obvious options, A and B, are actually incorrect. You don't use the gcloud IAM command to get a list of IAM policies. You actually need to use the gcloud projects command. So, if you want to list out all the IAM policies for a particular project, you would use D. Now, luckily, you don't have to memorize every single possible gcloud command, but you do want to be very familiar with the format of the most common operations.
Alrighty, it looks like we are at the Q&A session. So just a quick reminder, you can submit your question using the question box in your attendee control panel. So we'll give it a couple more minutes and then Danny will be able to hear.
Yeah, I think I got cut off a little there at the end, but now's a great time to write in your questions. If there was anything that wasn't clear or anything kind of confusing, if you want more information, feel free to type those in and I'll try to answer as best I can.
Looks like we're having some questions starting to come through. So
All right, someone asked if the session is being recorded. Yes, it is. I believe you should get emailed a link. I think we're saying within 36 hours.
that's correct.
Yeah. All right. So you should just check your email, make sure that the email is not going to accidentally end up in your spam folder, but you should get that within a day or 2. All right. Someone else asked, should I take the leader or the associate? So I'm assuming this is the digital leader exam or the ACE, the associate cloud engineer. That's a great question. It really depends on what your goals are. I could probably spend 20 minutes discussing it, but I'm just going to boil it down, make it really simple. The digital cloud leader is really more for non-technical managers or people that aren't engineers or developers. So it sort of makes it look like, yeah, if you look at the website, it sort of makes it look like you might want to take the digital leader first and then the associate cloud engineer and then maybe a professional as sort of like a naturally building progression. But that's not really the case. The digital leader is probably more accurately labeled cloud evangelist. So it's really about someone that's not super technical, that wants to learn about cloud and wants to learn about the business side, like how it makes sense financially, and then how you would sort of restructure your business to fit some of the new advantages that cloud gives you. So if you consider yourself technical, if you're some sort of engineer, if you're some sort of developer, programmer, coder, whatever, I would say skip the digital leader. I don't think that will be super useful for you. But if you're starting out from scratch and you know very little, then it might be useful. It will definitely introduce basic cloud concepts, and it will cover a lot of it'll cover a lot of very surface level information about the Google Cloud services, but you're not really going to come out of it knowing how to use Google Cloud very well. So if you want more practical, the ACE exam is better. If you're trying to get a job, like a lot of people want these certifications to get a job, I think the ACE will help you get an engineering job better. Whereas if you're a manager, again, non-technical, then maybe the digital leader would be better. All right, next question. Would Cloud Academy have all the resources, labs, and preparation for the certification exam? Yes, it does. So if you sign up for Cloud Academy, we have multiple different learning paths for all the main Google Cloud certifications. There's a couple we don't have, just to give you a heads up. One of them is not really a cloud certification. It has to do with what is it, Google Workspace, I think it's called. It's not really Google Cloud, but they throw it in there. And then there's a brand new one that's still in beta that we're currently working on, but it's not there. But yes, we have courses, we have labs, we have test exams, we have all of that. So theoretically, you go through everything that we provide that should prepare you for the exam. And that's exactly how I study for these exams and get my certs too. I don't take anyone else's stuff. As I said previously, depending on your level of expertise and knowledge, you might have to supplement with other information. So you can't come in with absolutely zero technical knowledge and then get everything from Cloud Academy. Like we expect that you come in like knowing how to program, knowing how to develop, using computers, VMs, some basic stuff. So if you've used another cloud provider and you've had some experience, yeah, I would say the Cloud Academy learning path would probably give you everything you needed. But yes, we do. We've got the courses, we've got the labs, you can play around and learn. We've got recommended reading. So if something was recently added and it's really minor and it doesn't justify a whole course, or sometimes there's like some really interesting blog posts that the information is good, but it really isn't appropriate for us to make a course on that. We just say, here, check out this Google blog post. All right. Let's see. Can you discuss certification path for beginners? Yeah, so that's sort of what I talked about before with the digital leader and the Google ACE exam. If you're technical or you want to be technical, then the ACE exam is probably the best place to start. There are professional level certifications as well. And so the question is, should I take the ACE first and then the professional? I would say that's sort of debatable. You probably, I mean, there would be some value in taking the associate exam and then going up to the professional, but it's not at all required. You can just take the professional if you want. So if you're going to be like a DevOps person, you might just say, I don't want to spend, as much time and money as it would take to do both. So I'm just going to study directly for the professional DevOps certification. And you could certainly do that. There wouldn't be a problem with that at all. There's a lot of overlap between the two. I mean, the DevOps exam is going to expect you have a lot of knowledge from the ACE exam. So if you did study for the ACE exam and passed it and then went to study the DevOps, you're going to have to do a lot less studying for DevOps because probably 50, 60% of the information you already know. Um, so if you're technical, do the ACE exam. If you don't know exactly where you're going, or if you just want like general information, if you know specifically where you want to go and there's a professional exam that matches up with that, then just study directly for the professional exam. And again, if you're non-technical, then that's what the digital leader is for. All right, someone says, I'm planning to take, I think it says, I'm planning to take the exam for the AZ900. Is this going to help me in the GCP exam? So the AZ900, I believe that is the Microsoft Azure. I don't have all the exam numbers memorized. Unfortunately, Microsoft gives them like AZ900, AZ200, that sort of thing. My coworkers that work on the Azure side would probably know which one that is. But generally, having knowledge in one cloud platform, even if it's not Google, will indeed help you prepare for Google because there's going to be a lot of overlap. So when I came in and started focusing more on Google Cloud, I knew a lot of AWS stuff and some Azure stuff. And so a lot of that information translated over. So obviously you're going to have to study and learn, oh, this product on Azure is called this, and the similar product, in Google Cloud is called this. But you can do a lot of the same things. Spinning up VMs, doing a lot of networking stuff is very similar. There's obviously some different names, and sometimes you'll be like, oh, this product does, a few more things here than, and it doesn't reflect that in the other cloud. So maybe Azure does a few more things that Google doesn't do, or Google does some things Azure doesn't do. And sometimes there's different ways of doing things, but generally, yes. Studying for an Azure or an AWS certification will definitely help in studying for Google. It's not a one-to-one, but I would say at least 60, 70, sometimes even 80% translates over pretty well. So you're not wasting your time if you're doing that. All right, next question. When a question has multiple correct answers, will the question say choose two or leave you wondering? Great question. Usually, if they want you to select multiple, they will give you the number. So usually they'll say pick two or pick three. But I can't guarantee that either. So Google's constantly changing its questions. So it's possible they might say, pick all of the correct answers. I don't remember them telling me to pick multiple and not telling me how many to look for, but I've taken so many Google exams that I might be forgetting one or two. So generally, they will tell you the number to choose. Usually that's pretty obvious, but not 100% guaranteed. All right, can Google Cloud be preferred over AWS and why? I get this question a lot. People say, which one's better? Which one should I choose? That's really hard to answer because it depends on many, many different factors. I will say AWS is generally more popular than Google Cloud in general. So if you're starting out and you're trying to maximize, trying to find a job, then you might want to lean towards learning AWS before Google. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Google isn't as good as AWS. In certain areas, I think Google Cloud is superior. It's superior to AWS. In other ways, it's weaker. So it depends on the product. I think if you're going to be doing like a lot of machine learning, I think Google does edge out AWS. If you're doing things like Kubernetes, Google came up with Kubernetes, they developed it, so they have the advantage there. So certain technologies, Google will be better on. Certain technologies, AWS will be better on. I mean, AWS has existed longer than Google, so they've been doing it for longer. They've figured out some issues a little bit better. They're a little bit more friendly with certain tools. So it's really hard to say, hey, this is always better than this. So what I suggest doing is figure out what your niche is going to be. If it's going to be artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things, whatever, and then see what everyone else is using. So if you're doing artificial intelligence, I think you're going to see a lot more people using Google Cloud than AWS. Next question. Did I hear correctly that the results of the exam don't break down pass-fail rates? Don't break down pass rates by categories. That's correct. That's one of the things I dislike about the Google exams. You go through the whole thing, you say submit, it says, are you sure? Are you sure you're ready to submit? You say yes, and then it says, okay. It gives you this really long, complicated disclaimer at the end, and then in really tiny text, it says your initial evaluation is pass or fail. And it's really small. You really have to read carefully to catch it. I think they do that so if someone's walking by or someone's sitting a few rows behind, they can't look over and see a big red fail and you get embarrassed or something like that. Yes, it doesn't tell you why you passed or failed. It doesn't break down categories. It doesn't tell you any information at all. It's literally just pass, fail. And then they say, oh, and we'll confirm it in a few days. So you might have to wait a few days. I think technically it might take like a week. So yeah, that's one thing I don't like. All right, someone said, I'm working as a desktop support engineer for 8 years. If I switch to cloud platform, could I get the same pay market? I can't really tell you what different companies are paying, and I can't tell what you would get. That's so subjective. I mean, theoretically, if you pass the ACE exam, that is going to theoretically that should help you get a higher salary, but I can't tell you. I don't want to make any guarantees about, oh yes, you'll get, X amount of dollars, you'll go up to a six-figure salary, and I can't promise that. There's too many variables involved. I mean, I've had so many jobs where my salaries bounced around greatly. It depends on, where I'm working. Some jobs I was working in the San Francisco Bay Area and I got really high ones. Other ones I worked remotely and I got less. And so it depends on too many factors. But theoretically, I would imagine a desktop support engineer who switched over to being a developer, an engineer, and got the training and the certification, you definitely should see a bump up in salary. All right, someone says I have no Google experience, and there's no way I would have. However, I do have Azure experience. Could I still study and pass Google ACE? What do you recommend? Yes, absolutely. Again, a lot of your knowledge will transfer over. You take our learning path at Cloud Academy. That will give you the training. It'll give you the labs. You can also sign up for a free Google account. There's a lot of things you can do for free. So play around with it on your own with a free account, and you can definitely pick it up. Someone says, if you're a solutions architect, professional certified, is it easier to get certified in GCP? It should be. Again, a lot of your knowledge will transfer over. So if you have a certification in AWS or Azure, it should be a lot easier. Again, you'll need to spend some time playing around with Google Cloud, and going through our courses will help, but a lot of your knowledge will transfer. Do you have any insight as to the interface used by the online proctor exams? I took certified Kubernetes admin exam and was surprised by the remote desktop to a Linux desktop. I have not taken any of the online proctor exams. I had a coworker that did. I believe it's pretty similar. I think they just have you log into a web page and fill out a form. You fill in little bubbles. I think it's basically the same as the in-person one. That's the impression that I was given. So I don't think they're going to do a remote desktop, but I don't know. I don't know if they have multiple companies doing it or if it's all centralized. Google doesn't really share a lot of those details. So it's possible they have multiple companies doing it for them and then they handle it different ways. So I don't have the experience, but I think it's pretty straightforward. But that's something I should ask my coworker about and see if there was any differences. He seemed to indicate that it was pretty much the same. He did it both online and in person, and he said they're pretty much the same, except they're a lot more strict for the online. All right, so we're running out of time, but I've got a few more questions I can get to. Does Google have an advocate program for those businesses that utilize Google Cloud? And if so, does passing the ACE exam open you up to network with these entities? That's something I do not know. I'm not sure about that. I could look into that and see, but offhand, I don't know that. Someone says, are there any remote jobs?
that support cloud jobs, any good websites. There are remote jobs out there for cloud. They definitely exist. I don't know of any offhand. As to how you discover these, that's really hard. I mean, I've been in the industry for a long, long time, so I don't really have to go out and search for jobs. I get a lot of I get a lot of people approaching me on LinkedIn and through other channels. So I've been doing this for so long. I've had enough experience. I've worked for enough big companies. Like I constantly have Google emailing me, Facebook emailing me, all these companies, or at least recruiters, I should say. I want to be accurate. I get all these recruiters constantly emailing me saying, "Hey, we've got this position. We want you to look at it." So I haven't had to start out on the bottom for a while. But when I started out, there were a bunch of websites you could go to. I know it definitely helps to have a LinkedIn page. I know a lot of them want to look at your LinkedIn work experience there. I think they tend to use that more than your physical paper printed out resumes. Um, if you're a programmer, it's good to have a GitHub repo full of code. They usually like looking at that. If you're not directly a programmer, you can still do things like put your templates in there. So if you're more like DevOps and you're spinning up these big complicated systems, you can use the Google Cloud templating system for that. So create a GitHub repo, put code in there, share that out with people. But I'm not sure what the really popular job websites are currently. So that looks like that's it. So we went a little over in time, but hopefully I got to all your questions. If not, remember I am on LinkedIn. Look me up on LinkedIn, send me a message, send me a friend invite. I can answer any questions I didn't get to, or if you think of something later, I'm always willing to help people out there.
Alrighty. Thank you, Daniel, for providing that information and great tips on how to successfully prepare and pass the Google ACE exam. So, on behalf of Cloud Academy, we thank you for joining us today and we hope to see you soon.
And good luck with your studies.